Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager here at CFN, and I'm joined today by Erick Ybarra. Erick Ybarra is a well-known author in the Catholic sphere, writer of many works, most notably The Papacy, revisiting the debate between Catholics and Orthodox. That's published by Emmaus Road Publishing. And also, he's known for writing a great little book on Melchizedek and the Eucharist, and also the Filioque, revisiting the doctrinal debate between Catholics and Orthodox. He also runs a great channel called Classical Christian Thought, and has made many contributions to shows such as Reason and Theology. So, how's it going, Erick?
Oh, it's going great. Thank you so much for having me on, and appreciate you listing out some of the books there. The Papacy book with Emmaus was a joy to write, and I was very blessed to be able to have the opportunity with St. Paul Center to publish that.
Yeah, and I can say this, from everything I've read, it's one of the most thorough works on the papacy. It's quite a tome. It's got like it's about 700, 800 pages, but it's full of great citations, great knowledge. I wanted to talk first, before we get into your works, I wanted to talk more about the man himself. I know
Sure.
you're a revert to the Catholic faith, and you've gone through a really long, winding road to get there. I know you've been a Reformed Protestant in the past and also an Anglican. So could you walk our audience through how did we get the scholar Erick Ybarra that we have today from the Protestant past?
Yeah. Well, I was originally born in Miami, Florida, Miami Beach. So if anybody's been down there, that's where I was originally. That's where I usually come from. I was born and raised down in South Florida. I was born into a Catholic family, so not a lot of people know that. So I was baptized at 6 months, and then I received my first Holy Communion at St. Patrick's Cathedral there in North Miami Beach, and but my Catholicism was very nominal. I was brought up in a very culturally Catholic environment. My family was awesome, but they didn't have a lot of religious commitments. And so it was really just by force of culture to go to Mass every Sunday. We did actually go to Mass every Sunday. But the level of penetration on catechesis and actually understanding what the gospel is, I never absorbed anything. And so by the time I became 13, 14, I started reading a lot of books, fiction, nonfiction, and I started hanging around a group of people who were, you could call them nerds. I was a nerd. And a lot of them doubted God, and they had philosophies that were more pointed towards atheism, agnosticism, skepticism. So I became an atheist, and then was an atheist throughout all my high school years. And I was back then. I was on online forums. This was before MySpace. This was before all the social media fellowship networks that we have today. This was back in the days where you'd write a comment, submit it for approval to like Yahoo Groups or something, and then you could look at it in a day or two to see if your post was up. And I'd argue for atheistic positions against religion. But when I hit university, when I turned 18, I came to university here in Central Florida, and I actually met a Christian who knew what he was talking about and could answer a lot of my questions. And he was gracious enough to give me a stack of books, a stack of CDs, and I just started reading scripture, started listening to PhDs like Peter Kreeft. I'd listen to him till 2 a.m. in the morning. And I started reading the Bible till 3 a.m. in the morning. And within 6 months, I had a radical conversion experience. And I went to the church of the guy who got me the material, and that was a Reformed Baptist church. And this Reformed Baptist Church was a very militant and seriously committed church of disciples. They get you into weekly Bible studies. I mean, studying Koine Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, reading commentaries, listening to scholarly MP3 lectures. For 5 years, my first 5 years there, I was every Tuesday night at a Bible study, every Friday night in fellowship, every Saturday going door to door evangelizing, spending hours afterwards talking about our conversations that we had, Sunday going to a 2 or 3 hour sermon, then going and hanging out with the believers all day, and then going back on Sunday night. So it was a lot. I learned a lot. Obviously, they were educating me towards a Protestant theology, but I picked up a lot of skills, hermeneutics, exegesis. I picked up how to read. Some of the classical works they were giving us, like Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book. So I picked up some necessary skills over the course of 5 years that ended up helping me for basically all the way up through my adult life till now.
If I can ask you something about that, it sounds like you kind of fit into the stereotype of the Reformed tradition, the super intellectual side to that. Were you a tulip 5-point Calvinist at the time, or was that really outside of that specific community's concern and your concern at the time?
Well, that's interesting because when I first visited the church, they were in between Free Will Baptist and 5-point Calvinism. So they were kind of like in the middle. But as a result of the pastor studying more and more, it became a 5-point tulip, Charles Spurgeon-esque Reformed Baptist church. And so I naturally went that way for some years. I actually changed my mind about the 5-point Calvinism while I was there. So they just equipped everybody there who was committed to learning how to live a life of prayer, learning how to develop spiritual disciplines. And they did point us to the church fathers. We selectively read the church fathers. The way that we looked at it was we would eat the meat and spit out the bones, but obviously there was more bone than there was meat, and from their perspective, Interestingly enough, my pastor would say that our spiritual ancestry is really in the Donatists of North Africa. So we were a very separatist group. We didn't have a lot of fellowship with other churches around us, because we felt that they were apostatized. They didn't evangelize. They weren't preaching repentance enough. They weren't emphasizing hell enough. They were not conducting confrontational discipleship, church discipline. And so the church had many good things, but it was an overzealous attempt at reproducing the true church without the right authority. And so invariably it led to a number of splits. And when you split from a church like that, you don't know where to go, because you've been taught that everywhere else is illegitimate. And so I ended up having to hit the books, taking all the skills that they gave me to go into libraries and seminaries and just walking up and down the aisles and looking for books on history, doctrine, systematic theology. And I would just sit and read. And if I found something interesting, I scanned the book into pages and left late in the night. And so I ended up walking through a horizon from Lutheranism, sat down with Lutheran priests, and went the whole Reformed horizon until I found the Trail of Canterbury and became an Anglican. And that was like a climax because I felt like I could absorb history while at the same time not having to stick my neck out for certain things that I thought were just a little too much to believe in, like in Catholicism or Orthodoxy.
Mm.
Uh, so yeah, so I was an Anglican, but as I pursued the truth there, I noticed that we also had questionable origins because the Anglican church I was going to, um, we were very conservative, so we had no communion with like the Mother See of Canterbury. And when you dig into the history of that, we were a sliver of a break off of a break off of a sliver because of just all these contentions that come up over time. And so it led me to really look at ecclesiology. It wasn't something I was always interested in, but I felt like I needed to study it, and so that's going to put me right into the studies of the papacy.
Mm.
And so I started reading about the papacy, contacting experts around the globe, both English speakers, Greek speakers, French speakers, trying to get the best material to learn both traditional, antique studies on the papacy, but also modern studies. And I took, 10 years of research. And I thought, because it planted me at the fork between Rome and Byzantium. And I knew that I would have to make a decision between those two. And so I took all the research I had gained, and I thought to myself, there's no way to keep this all in between these two ears. I want to put it into a document. So that's the genesis of the book.
Wow. Yeah. So it's rooted. You see, the thing I really like about your content is that many people today are stuck in that same position. They feel a sort of anguish by trying to figure out, am I going Eastern Orthodox? Am I going branch theory Anglican? Am I going Roman Catholic? And there is a spiritual anguish that comes with that. Having an experience with that is very useful when applying it to this. I wanted to ask you about some of the sources that you used with this work, because I find personally, when we look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you've mentioned this, I think, in other shows before as well, we see a lot of scholarship from Anglicans. Denny's book, for example, Papalism, that are really ruthless critiques of the papacy. And we also see more recently things like Meyendorff on the Byzantium side. But at the same time, when it comes to the Roman Catholic perspective, I see that scholarship is sort of lacking during these eras in comparison to these other perspectives. Why do you think that was? Why do you think we hit that dryness of scholarship from the Roman Catholic perspective?
That's a great question. I think one of the reasons is that, and this is going to be turning the clock back a little more into history, but around the 1700s, 1600s and 1700s, after the Reformation, there was a resurgence of studies in the patristics by Protestants. And Catholics were acquaint, obviously the doctors, the sacred, the well-educated doctors of theology knew the fathers, but the Lutherans and the Calvinists, but more so the Lutherans, were really looking into the fathers, and so it motivated the Catholics to do the same. And there were a number of giants who were up to the task of actually confronting the Protestant arguments. I'm thinking of a guy like Saint Robert Bellarmine, right? But not everybody was a Bellarmine. And Protestants ended up getting the better hand in the world of academia over the course of the next 200 years with Um, Protestant liberalism just it was something to majorly fund. They had the money, they had the institutions to back them up, to get the translations done, to pursue further study. Then you had, the well-known, post-Enlightenment, higher critical studies, literary criticism, form criticism, text criticism. The Protestants were kind of ahead of the Catholics. It took time for the traditional popes to even open the door through the Pontifical Commission for the Scriptures, to even start looking at things on, how to understand inerrancy in ways that it can incorporate culture and the historical bridge for interpretation. And so I think that so the Protestants had a greater discipline for a long time. Not that they were right, I mean, you could talk to somebody who might talk your ear off with a bunch of facts, but that doesn't mean they're right. And so I think that Catholicism obviously is right, but there were times where in the world of academia, where thoughts are being printed on paper, Protestantism just excelled. Eastern Orthodoxy wasn't even a child on the block. And so Anglicans especially wrote just scores of literature on church history and ecclesiology. And so I want to say that there were a number of great Catholic writers who saw this and they felt the need to embark upon the study. So I'm thinking of a guy like Father Adrian Fortescue or Thomas William Allies. Um, there's a number of them that wrote books on the papacy, mostly dealing with Protestant objections. Some of them dealing with Eastern Orthodox objections. I think of like Monsignor Pierre Batifol, right? He wrote some things. Yves Congar wrote some things dealing with the Byzantine objections, but it just Eastern journals, academic journals on like East-West issues, usually was a cross intersection between predominantly Anglican writers, some newly English-speaking Orthodox writers like Meyendorff, Schmemann, Georges Florovsky, and a few very extremely ecumenical Catholics. And in the world of Catholic academia, I think the Catholic scholars were always more ecumenical than were the Anglican and Orthodox counterparts. And so they didn't have the spark, to really try to emphasize why Catholicism is the way rather than a way. And obviously the ecumenical movement really didn't help. So today, you're more apt to find a Catholic scholar in church history who, if you talk to him on a Monday night at a Starbucks, or go to have a drink with him, he'll sound like he's just conceding everything away. Like, Catholicism was some sort of invention over time. And to find a well-decorated Catholic historian who's actually going to know the sources and attempt to make a defense for the traditional Catholic views, that's very hard to come by nowadays. You have them, but they're not in the plenty, you see. So that's such a fascinating question, Murray. I think I could go on answering it, but I think that ecumenicalism didn't help. The left-leaning direction and posture of Catholic seminaries, and just the falling victim to Protestant academics on the church councils. You'll find Catholic historians referring to Protestant literature on the ecumenical councils and how to determine what was being done and said about Honorius or Vigilius or Hadrian. So from a Protestant point of view, it just looks like Catholicism has sort of just handed in the towel. You know, so I thought that, there have been some giants that I have the ability to step on their shoulders, as it were. But I felt there was definitely a need to sort of come at this from a rigorous point of view, looking at the data and not making any further assumptions than what the data demands, but in defense of Catholicism rather than just why all the options are still available for people to equally choose well from.
Yeah. And I completely, I see that in your work, and you're right. If you read someone like Congar, I find that you sit there and you're like, well, we've conceded everything at this point, and you have to accept that the papacy is really in some sort of mystical sense that we don't even understand yet. So it's refreshing to see, as you mentioned, a rigorous perspective on the papacy in such a work. I wanted to get more into the issue itself when it comes to the papacy, because in modern arguments, I find, especially with Eastern Orthodox, many of them will say, "Well, we believe that we believe in the papacy, at least in some sense. We believe that he is the first among equals. We'll give him even a source of primacy." When it comes to this debate, what is the key fundamental issue that we need to prove, and that you set out to prove in this work, that would set Catholicism apart as being the true religion compared to something like Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy, for example?
Yeah, that's really the best place to start, because you have a lot of people out there, Anglicans, Orthodox, Lutherans, for goodness sake, who are willing to say primacy. Yay! Yes, yes, yes. Supremacy, no. And so they're already they're already saying, yeah, we can step onto the boat and stream and sail through church history with the idea of the Roman bishop being in leadership. And, we could nod our heads all day long at that. But there's a contrast, a fundamental contrast between that and what was put into codification at the councils of Lyons, Florence, and Vatican I. So what we have to do as Catholics to make ourselves relevant, to deserve a speaking space at the table, we have to show that there is something about the historical evidence in the first millennium that puts the papacy, as it is illustrated in history, into a category that Anglicans and Orthodox cannot absorb at all, because they're always claiming about how they can absorb primacy. They can absorb, the apostolic see being the first see, the see of primacy, this, and that. Some of them will even say, well, the word supremacy just means highest. So we could even go with the language of supremacy. Kind of like, how do you want your pizza? Supreme Pizza's got everything on it. Well, the Roman bishop was the first, so we could even say that, but it's still not Vatican I. So what we have to do is we have to find what is the DNA of the Vatican I teaching, and then extract it and then compare it to what we find in the first millennium. So in the beginning of the book on the papacy, I think I come up with 4 things or 3 things. Sometimes I'll say 5, 3 or 4. It really is. It comes down to this. Between Catholics and Orthodox, we both believe that Jesus Christ created a magisterium that in the apostles, right? He sent them out to teach. We can all agree on that. Catholics and Orthodox believe that he established an ongoing magisterium. We all believe in apostolic succession. The Eastern churches and Catholicism. We all believe that. But Catholicism teaches that there's a certain detailed design within the magisterium of the apostles that is supposed to be etched into the DNA so much that design can never fizzle away for whatever reason, right? And so that design is that you have a head department and a members department. Peter, as an individual, as a single person, is set over the apostles in such a way that it's not merely like honorific, where it's just a matter of a functional primacy of he gets to speak first, or he gets to have his name at the top of documents, or he is the one who can speak on behalf of all after he's collected everybody's opinions and votes, right? No, it has to be that Peter is set aside and given a unique authority, like a jurisdiction. We use the terminology of jurisdiction nowadays. Back then, they would have just used, auctoritas, potestas, uxisios, Greek and Latin words for power and authority. And so we're looking for Peter being set over the apostles, and that authority given to Peter over the apostles is not something that dies with Peter, not something that dies with the apostles, but it goes into the apostolically succeeding Episcopal College, so that you still have a Peter to member hierarchical distinction with respect to the universal church, and that it's divinely designed. And so it's embedded into the very biology of the church, into the very DNA of the church. Just like Orthodox would say that the office of the bishop, the Eucharist, the sacraments, all those things are embedded into the DNA of the church. So you can't have 100 years, 500 years, and 700 years where you don't have a Eucharist or a bishop, right? The Orthodox understand that, so they understand what it means when something is so divinely instituted that it's embedded into the very biological life of what the church is, essentially. So you have this universal primacy in Peter's successor located in Rome. Okay, that's where Peter stationed his primacy. That's where it will continue as a fixed historical reality going forward. And that this design, by force of consequence of what has been said about its being part of the DNA of the church, will last until the end of time. Now, I've not said anything about infallibility there. I've not said anything about supremacy there. I've not said anything about ex cathedra. I've not said anything about whether he can depose bishops at will, install deacons in Asia if he wanted to, fire priests in Hawaii. I've not gone into anything like that. But what I've done is I've said, okay, when you read Vatican I, starting from the beginning of its constitution, it begins with this patronological theory that's embedded into the DNA of the church. Well, if we can go into the church fathers and the 7 ecumenical councils and the Holy Scripture as it was received, as it was taught, as it was expressed in the patristic era of the first millennium, and we can see that this is an essential thing, well, the things about infallibility, ex cathedra, supremacy, those things that are just going to be orbiting implications, they're not going to be something that I need to go prove from the 2nd century anymore, because I've already showed you that the Orthodox don't have a biological ecclesiology that has this patronological, DNA theory. So the Orthodox don't hold it because they believe they believe that the primacy of Peter in Rome was a historical accident that was there. It was helpful. It was great. When the engine was running, it was good.
Hmm.
But when it broke down, that's it. We moved on, and we're moved on for 1,000 years. Anglicans, hey, it was great until the 16th century. It broke down. It was great. We can accept it if they completely gut the engine out and make it into something new. But we're going to move on with the Church of England ecclesiology, right? So if the fathers teach, if they teach us something about this divinely instituted papacy in Rome over the universal church in such a way that it is precisely comparable to the divinity of the sacraments, the divinity of the episcopate, of conciliar infallibility, all these things, if they're looking at it as an organ that Christ created, well, now we're forced to try and show how our current ecclesiology matches that. And I don't think there's any other ecclesiology that can match that except for Catholicism. And so what I've just run you through, we don't even need to get into infallibility, because I could just tell the Orthodox, I say, well, look at the value of looking at it this way. I don't even need to talk about infallibility. I can just ask you. 3 of the 7 ecumenical councils say that Christ gave Peter the keys of the kingdom, and as a result of that, all the bishops of Rome have a universal primacy until the end of time. Does your church believe that? Well, we don't believe in Vatican I. Well, hold on a second. We haven't even gotten to the issue of ex cathedra infallibility yet. I'm asking you, from the data in the first millennium, Christ gives Peter the keys. As a result of that, the successor of Peter in Rome has a everlasting primacy over the universal church until Christ comes back. I didn't say anything about ex cathedra yet. Can you absorb that? Because if you can't absorb the first millennium. We can absorb it, but we have some extra work to do to find some implications that lead to these ex cathedra formulae, infallibility formulae, supremacy jurisdiction formulae. All those things are organically connected to what is essentially there. So I don't know if you see the difference. It's a different project than what most papal apologetics was in the past, because everybody's trying to go and find instances of infallibility and the Pope firing a bishop in Uganda. That's just not that's not the project that I'm doing.
And I want to ask you a little bit about those extra steps, because when I was reading your book, the thing that comes that I see it as there's 2 big concerns. The first is you making positive arguments for what you've just laid out, showing that this was within the first millennium. The second, and this is what I wanted clarification from you is you mentioned this in your, I believe it's in the introduction. You use a great analogy talking about a boxing match, right? It goes,
oh yeah.
We make the Catholics make a claim, and you say we win, but it takes about 12 rounds in a boxing match. Because the Orthodox do land some blows on us. Now, I saw this as you making a charitable concession to the Orthodox, mentioning that they have some valid concerns. I don't think they've been so charitable in that in their view of what you've said about that. I was hoping you could clarify this for our audience about what do you mean in that sense that I can't remember the exact way of you phrased it, but it's sort of we won not just barely, but we won through a tough effort.
Yeah. So it deserves clarification. So what I mean by that is I don't mean that the Orthodox ecclesiology has voluminous data to prove their side. I don't. I really don't. I think the volume of the data is definitely on the Catholic side. But there are 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 instances in history out of 1,000 years, where the papal theory gets tested to its max, to the point where if you just stay there and look at the face of it, prima facie, it looks like we shoot a blank. Like the papacy is brought to its ultimate test to see if it really has a bullet to shoot, and out comes a blank. There are a few instances in history where I don't think it's successful, but there are some surprisingly unexpected realities that push the challenge where to a degree that a Catholic may not have expected. So Pope Honorius, Pope Vigilius are two of the most famous examples where you would not have predicted something like that if you were a Catholic. If Catholic ecclesiology is true, that is not exactly something that you would think you'd have to handle. So now that they've happened, the question is, did the papacy get proven false, or is there some way to handle the data and the facts in such a way that the papacy still survives? And I think the first millennium already proved that, because after Pope Honorius was condemned in the 7th century, the 8th and 9th century still believed in the papacy. So it's obvious that the characters in the story did not believe that the papacy was out the window. Same thing with Vigilius in the 6th century. So we look at how they handled the matter, and we give reasons for why the papacy still is true, even though these things happen. But that is a little bit of a mountain climb. And so not everybody's equipped for that. Not everybody has the knowledge on how to deal with it. So because there are people out there who will never pick up the backpack and do the mountain climb, it will look like the Orthodox kind of like won. For others who are willing to look into it a little bit, they might manage to say, "Oh, no, this is not a deal breaker," In which case, they'll at least sense, well, the Orthodox came in strong in that round, even though it was just once or twice, they came back strong. But I don't think they rob the victory. So there's so much volume to the papacy and the divine constitution of the primacy and the episcopate, the way that Catholicism teaches it in the first 10 centuries. It's there. It's all over the place. So the volume is definitely on our side, but there are a couple of punctures that almost reach the heart. And so that's what I kind of mean by that. It could be a little confusing, but I don't mean like all the way through the Orthodox. For every 10 things a Catholic says, an Orthodox can bring up 9.5 things. I don't. It deserves clarification.
Yeah, I do think they've misrepresented you on that, and so thank you for clarifying that. You mentioned how a part of this argument, we need to demonstrate that our ecclesiology currently matches with what we see in the first millennium. And a big reason why I wanted to have you on, Erick, is because many people are scandalized recently, of course, with the same-sex blessings document, Fiducia Supplicans. People are scandalized by what I see as people are noticing, well, it looks like there might have been some non-definitive papal error with something like Amoris Laetitia or the conciliar and post-conciliar documents. What I wanted to ask you is that, looking back and with some of the examples that you brought up, do we see precedent for this sort of crisis that we're living in the first millennium, specifically with somebody like Pope Vigilius and the Three Chapters controversy, or Pope Honorius? Do we see, is there a similar precedent in the first millennium, or are those things blown out of proportion?
I think there is precedent. And what's so beautiful about a Honorius situation is that you have precedent whether you're a defender of Honorius or you're not. So there are some people out there who will say that Honorius was misunderstood, the council was wrong, he was actually innocent. Okay, even if you go with that, even if you go with that, look at what you've got here. You've got an ecumenical council, a pope, another ecumenical council, another ecumenical council, and another ecumenical council. So 4 ecumenical councils, plus plenty of popes who had to give oath at their oath of office, reiterating and echoing the anathema against Pope Honorius, not just for negligence, but for being an instigator and being one condemnation says that he was like the patron of monothelitism. So some really striking anathemas. So even if you think Honorius, was innocent, but his innocence, the proof of his innocence was buried, and what the church absorbed was that a Roman pontiff could do damage in his office on a matter of the faith, you at least have to admit that the church understood that this was compatible with the divine office of the papacy, because the divine office of the papacy was the one who was anathematizing Honorius. Mm-hmm. So they obviously saw a concurrency between the papacy and a Honorius situation. Vigilius is another, tragic event, but has its own lingering beauty for our purposes, because he was alive, whereas Honorius was dead. So in many ways, excuse me, in many ways, the Honorius episode disqualifies from too much comparison to what's going on today, because Honorius was sleeping happily in the grave, but Vigilius was standing. And yet, even then, a council which recognized 2 things. The only president of an ecumenical council is Peter's successor. It recognized that. Number 2, it recognized that if they broke communion with the See of Rome, they would be outside of the church. So what they ended up doing was they ended up using the crime of heresy as a reason for why they could ignore Vigilius while maintaining a legal communion with the See of Rome, because they thought that by his crime, he alienated himself from the office. So that's not an Orthodox paradigm. That's not an Orthodox paradigm. Some people think it's not a Catholic one, but it's not an Orthodox one. And I think we've not had a settled matter on whether that's a Catholic paradigm or not. I think John of St. Thomas, Cajetan, give us enough material hundreds of years later to where if this controversy can fall into the lap of a new pope, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we may get some resolutions on how to explain what's going on.
Yeah, that's great insight on it. And I find the my favorite chapters in the book is your dealing with these certain historical events. The one on Vigilius is especially nice. I wanted to move on to a separate topic, which is concerning another book that you wrote, which is the Filioque. It's a great synopsis of the controversy. I had a friend that is a more liberal Catholic. He made an argument to me recently, talking about how even if the papal claims of Vatican I were exaggerated, that it wouldn't mean that you should stop being a Catholic, because it all comes down to the Filioque. I wanted to see what you thought about that. Do you think that the Filioque is a more important matter than the papacy, or do you find it subordinate to the papacy question?
That's another. You got some really good questions, man.
I try. You know.
So it depends. Okay, so it has greater importance historically, because when the Greeks were justifying their separation from Rome, the first 20 years or so, it was all about the bread that we were using in Holy Mass, right? But after that, it was the Filioque, okay? And it wasn't just the word addition to the creed, the creedal construction matter was a contention, but their issue was they believed that the Filioque was a monstrous destruction to the doctrine of God. They saw it as Arianism, Apollinarianism. I mean, you name it. One of the Trinitarian heresies, one of the Christological heresies. That's how they saw it. And because they see the Filioque as heretical, and because it was the constant justification for their severance from Rome from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, it's their defining it's their defense for why the schism happened, right? That you do have complaints about the claims of power from the Pope. You do, right? You've got like Simeon of Thessaloniki, you've got Nihilus Kabasilos, you've got a number of folks that are saying, hey, yeah, like Peter was the first, but he wasn't ruling everybody like with an iron fist. But that just doesn't take up the volume of their accusations. The accusation is Filioque. And the reason why that's important is because the Filioque, in precisely the way that Florence taught it, is absorbed into the Latin patrimony of the West long before Eastern Orthodox dates Roman Catholicism. The Orthodox date Roman Catholicism to 1054, perhaps. That's a symbolic date, at least between Constantinople and Rome. Well, before 1054, you don't have Roman Catholicism according to Eastern Orthodoxy. So if you go into the See of Lyons or the See of Aquila, or if you go to the See of Ravenna, the See of Arles, the See of Hatfield, England, Canterbury, those are Eastern Orthodox Christians before 1054, right? All the way back to the first century. Well, that's a problem now, because if we can find the Filioque in early Christian writers, and not just early Christian writers, but saints, and not just saints, but theological doctors that the ecumenical councils enumerate as holding special seats, like Augustine, St. Leo the Great, St. Ambrose, Gregory the Great. If those guys held to the Filioque as Florence taught it, as Lyons taught it, as we teach it today, then that would mean that the justification for the Greek schism is, without knowing it, a sort of anathema to the Western calendar for the Eastern Orthodox.
Hmm.
So, what material evidence did it take for the Sixth Council to condemn Honorius? 2 letters, right? 2 letters to Sergius. We have volumes of Augustine on the Filioque.
Yeah, and this is why you hear many Eastern Orthodox. This is a real problem for them, I think, because the struggle to incorporate Saint Augustine into Eastern Orthodoxy it's still prevalent to this day because that is such a an issue. And I think there is ample evidence to show that the Filioque is in the first millennium. I wanted to go back on something you said, which is dating the schism. That's something that in the last chapter of your book, that's something you touch on a little bit, and you hear this this mythical date, right? The 1054 schism date, when in reality, even the Eastern Orthodox, I've seen, for example, Metropolitan Callistos Ware, I believe, had a article on this talking about this is a complicated issue. It cannot just be dated to 1054. When do you see the schism as being formalized, as we really do have in reality 2 separate communions?
Yeah. These are things that I think about in my dreams, So sometimes I'll have a different answer on a different week,
Mhm.
I don't want to belittle what happened in 1054, right? Because it was a very defining moment. And it did sort of, it did put a scar into what existed between East and West, because it wasn't like Rome wrote a letter and said, "Oh, no, that we do have beards and we don't use unleavened bread." And the Greeks knew that this was going on, and they started developing their lists. Today we call them Byzantine lists. Back then they were just the monastic lists or the doctrinal lists against the Latins, and they didn't have like formal authority, but you had like the movie Gangs of New York, you had already the material for these gang fights in between the Latins and the Greeks, but the patriarchs didn't elevate it to a matter to break apart, mostly because a council was not called. You had other issues that were political issues in relation to Byzantium, in relation to Germany, in relation to conflicts with popes and Western rulers. Having an ecumenical council just was not going to happen. So when you had the Crusades come into play, um, theological divisions sort of went on the shelf, right? Until the sack. And when the sack of Constantinople happened, and when news of it went out, that's when they were like, okay, we don't just have disagreements with the Latins, we despise them now. This is something that we're telling our kids at dinner now. We're going to talk to our little children about this now. And then especially when Constantinople got its occupation back, because after the sack, Rome installed a Latin patriarch in the city of Constantinople, right? Well, once the Greeks got their occupation of their city back, there was a reunion effort at the Council of Lyons, 1274, and at that council, the Pope at the time, whose name escapes me for now, but the Pope at the time put demands on the Greeks: filioque, supremacy. Um, it's all right to use unleavened bread. It's all right to have beards or no beards. A number of things that put some demands. And then you had a pro-union party in Constantinople. One of the symbolic figures of that was John Bekkos, Bekkos, or Beta Epsilon Kappa Kappa
Mhm.
Omicron Sigma Becos. And that reunion effort to recognize the orthodoxy, the historical precedent of the Filioque was completely shut out by a small council held in Blackerne, some facilities near Constantinople. The Council of Blackerne, 1285, 1284, I can't remember. They definitively rejected the Filioque as a heresy worthy of anathema. So Blackerne marks a very important date in making official this schism. Reunion was offered and it was rejected on theological grounds. So you have a schism there, that's 1280s already, but so you have it widening, but really, I mean, where it's like total, and some people even debate that, it's shortly after the Council of Florence in the 1460s, 1460s, 1470s, 1480s, Constantinople. They were justifying their non-acceptance of the Council of Florence. The Latins were heretics, capiche. That's it. You know, theologians out there like Callistus, where some Jesuit scholars have been able to find pockets of areas where intercommunions had been going on no matter what. Regardless, even withstanding that, I think you have a definitive schism right after Florence.
Yeah, and it's quite a complicated issue. I think you can draw the line anywhere really in between the Phocian schism and
Yeah.
Ferrara Florence, and it's complex. And what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is necessary in order for union to occur between these two communions? I know the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox, it's sort of a separate problem, but when it comes to these two communions, the Eastern Orthodox, and you can really see it as multiple, because we have, of course, the schism between Moscow and Constantinople. But what practically do you think needs to be done to find union between both parties?
Yeah, this is like the go-to question for everybody who's on, into the East-West, debates and everything.
That's
And
right.
the problem is, the first problem that needs to be recognized is that what the Latins were and what the Greeks were in 880 during the Phocian affair, or 1053 during 1054 during the Cerularian affair, or 1270 1284 during the Cypriotic Blackerne affair, or 1440 during the Florentine affair. What the Latins were then and what the Greeks were then at each of those points is not what they are today. We've all changed in our separation. In many ways, we've gained things that complicate the question of reunion. Some things, I think, on the Catholic side, we've been very generous, in my opinion. But Eastern Orthodoxy, as a result of the Arab invasions, Turkish occupation of Constantinople, eventually the diaspora, Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet, I mean, all these things, these immigrations of churches into different bodies globally, the Orthodox have sort of tangled themselves up right now in a way that it's like they're not reunion ready. They just don't have the green light on to do that, because it's kind of like if you have a green light to use a restroom, or a red light, it's occupied. They don't even have the green light for talking about this yet, because they've got their own tangle right now. And it was brewing, like what happened in 2016, 2018, Council of Crete, then with the the jurisdiction of Ukraine. Those issues were brewing for a long time, because of differences between Constantinople and Moscow and other places. So right now they can't really. It's like it's like if we just asked the room of Orthodox leaders what needs to be done, you'd have 1,000 different answers, and so because of that, it's just there's no qualification right now to be given. And in Catholicism, yeah, we've given some massive generous relaxations. It's like we don't even demand them to believe in the Filioque anymore. um, i'm sure that if Pope Francis had the pen to write down what needs to be done by the Orthodox, we're talking about a severely relaxed terms of union. But the problem is that Catholicism, we've destroyed a number of things like our liturgy, our and when I say destroyed, I don't mean, you know what I mean. I'm not saying it's become extinct. There might be somebody who he says destruct,
We'll do a clip of just that, right?
Right. We've done enough to make our face just really ugly. It's just really ugly. The uglification of Catholicism is the number one hindrance right now to the union with the Eastern Orthodox, and I say that even with regard to the papacy, because the papacy, yes, we have to maintain Vatican I, Vatican II, but we can also recognize that the principle of subsidiary, which even the popes recognized, that should be practiced even in our own house first, before the Orthodox are going to find that they could live with it. When you've got a complete strikeout of a bishop like Strickland, or a complete strikeout of bishops, totally far from Rome, the idea of subsidiary or fair trial or a recognition of zones of hierarchy, that just the Orthodox look at that and they're like, yeah, right. They're all talking about synodality. They're all talking about hierarchy and how there's a court of appeals process. Yeah, right. I mean, look at what's going on. So we've got our own tangle right now. And so I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're not close to reunion with the Orthodox. And we haven't even gotten to the doctrinal questions yet.
Yeah, I mean, because you can also talk about rebaptism of converts, and it's a huge tangle. And I think you're right. Unfortunately, I could foresee maybe union with one or two C's, but ultimately, it doesn't look that hopeful at the moment. And so, and I wanted to mention that there's two perspectives when it comes to, really, I think it comes down to two perspectives for Catholics trying to defend the current tangle that we are in. And one is sort of put your head in the sand, pretend that not only is everything great, but and fine, but it's the best it's ever been. And the other is this sort of sobering but realistic perspective on where we're at right now, which is a mess, quite frankly. And I think it's important that we do that. To sort of wrap things up, Erick, even though we are, of course, Catholic Family News, I do know we have a few non-Catholics that watch the show, and they're trying to discern, where do I go in this current nightmare that is the world? Do I go Orthodox? Do I go Catholic? Do I go High Church Anglican? And they're in that anguish that it sounds like you were in the process of your reversion. What advice would you give them, outside of course, they've got to read your books? What advice would you give to these people sincerely trying to figure out this current crisis practically?
Yeah. Very good question. I find myself circling back to this question too. So I'm before I even attempt to give an answer, I need the listeners to know that this is a point of meditation for me as well. Um, I think that um, your spiritual life is very important because you can't expect to answer a question that has plagued souls now for 1,000 years. East-West issues, let alone high church Anglicanism, Anglo-Catholicism versus Catholicism. Um, you can't expect to get an answer if you're living in sin. I mean, that's obvious, right? So if you're living in sin and you're just looking at the arguments and it doesn't matter what is the arguments, it doesn't matter who the person is. Yeah, you're probably not going to get too far in your confidence in what you're seeking for. So you really got to seek the Lord and get rid of anxiety, because that's one of the things that I struggled with, the anxiety over it. Because what we show the world, what we show ourselves, what we show our families and our friends, if we're full of anxiety over this, is that ultimately God is not our savior. What our savior is academic knowledge. And boy, that is nothing further from the truth, right? So you have to just look at, get alone with the Lord and say, Lord, I want you to help me see the truth. I'm an open vessel. Deliver me from error. Lead me to the truth, even if it's so uncomfortable for me. Bring verification of it, and I'm going to go slowly, because holy men, smart men who are holy, have also taken a long time in this. I'm not asking for a quick answer, although if you want to give one, I'll take it. Um, Help me and guide me in this and lead me to, the right sources. That's what I had to do, and I believe God answered me. Um, and so that's number one. But it's not going to be just 100% spiritual. It's not going to be 100% academic. It's going to be a little bit of all, because just like um, the theologians during the Arian crisis, they had to hit the books, and they had to get their knees in prayer. Right? It's both. Life and godliness, as Paul said to Titus. So start building a good library with good authors. Don't just read Catholics. And now this is a little dangerous, right? Because if we're going back 100 years, most confessors would never advise people to do this. But we're in a different era now, and I think the information zone is just, you're going to run into opposing arguments, and why not get good opposing arguments from sincere people now? And so I in my book, I quote from a lot of non-Catholic sources. You could start with my book. My book was intended I wrote it first and foremost for my kids, so that they had a place to start if they're ever going to embark upon this study. But my book is going to get you into the first 10 centuries. And it's not always pampering the Catholic side. There are some times where I recognize some challenges that just haven't been resolved, um, and then get look at the Orthodox side. I'm not a huge fan of some of the Orthodox apologetics online, but there's one Ubi Petrus where, if you can ignore some of the, just for lack of a better term, just the childishness of it, you can try to get some of the better arguments from the Eastern side. But I think even then you're kind of notice that there's some deficiencies there, just on not necessarily on a doctrinal level, but listen to the opposing sides, and then be honest. Be honest with what you're seeing, and then get some mentors. Get some people who who have studied this issue before you, and that you can kind of have conversations with. They can challenge you, you can challenge them, and sort of creating like a small little, table talk where you can drop your doubts, and you got to be careful, because some people, you could really hurt their faith. There's some people in your life that are probably too fragile in the Lord to just start dropping, like, yeah, but what about this? Right? It's just going to really destroy someone's faith. You need to find people who are stronger than you in the faith to talk about your difficulties, not your doubts necessarily, but your difficulties. I wish I could tell you go and get, it's just a matter of getting the right Willy Wonka chocolate bar with the golden ticket. I really wish it could, but it's not. It's not that way. And you can know that if you're seeking the Lord with all of your heart, even before Vatican II, the church has taught that there may be a sufficient amount of ignorance that you have, but if you loved God with perfect charity, you don't have anything to worry about. I hate to put it that way, because it sounds like I'm being indifferent or like a religious pluralist, and I don't want to be that way. I'm the farthest thing from that in the world. But if it's going to keep your sanity, just know that is a teaching even way before Vatican II. But once you feel your conscience pulling you into Catholicism, you need to start making an action. So yeah, I mean, there's much more to say, but I think that living the spiritual life, being calm, not being fret with worry, and then also start learning how to read, start learning how to study. Look, if you pick any of my books in my library, I create a trail in the book. I write summaries of chapters. I underline keywords. I'll write a summary of the book in the back, so I can go back and reread a 300-page book in like an hour. I don't even need to read the whole book, because I've made a trail. So learning how to study, learning how to read, so that you can go back and get all of what you've read instead of having to rely on your memory. Constant note-taking. I found what helped me is just every few months, okay, let me write down what are the reasons why I should become Orthodox, what are the reasons why I should become Catholic, and create like a like a table, and revisit it as you study. So yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like coaching basketball here, but some people it's going to be a long haul. Some people it might not be as long, but some people it might be long.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. And one of the great things about this book, the Papacy book that you wrote, is it shows how Catholicism is tied with reason. You're not afraid to deal with somebody like Denny or Puller, for example. And these difficult objections to Catholicism, you take them head on, and so I appreciate that. Outside of these books, where can people find you, Erick?
Yeah, so I get asked to get on channels every now and then. So sometimes you can find the latest just by like going to YouTube and typing my name. But I do hop on to my own channel every week or so. It's Classical Christian Thought. I also have a Patreon, Classical Christian Thought. My YouTube community, I post my articles, a lot of articles there, or on Facebook too. I've been commenting a lot about church politics, issues around the Vatican. So yeah, those are the areas.
Yeah, so definitely go check out Erick over there at Classical Christian Thought. And you can also check out more of CFN's work. We have the February paper has just hit the presses. That should be out soon. We've got some articles in there talking about that touch on the Eastern Schism. So if you're interested in that, especially how it relates to Russia, I would recommend checking that out. If you like more of this content, you can click like or subscribe. And Erick, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.